Okay, so Michael, we are now live on a special edition of Catalyst Talks and USTomorrow coming together. First of all, how are you? Have you got power and water, and how's your family?
I'm good. Family's good. Thank you for asking. We were without heat for 4 days, no power and internet for 2.5 days. Our boil water notification just lifted like a day or so ago. We are back in modernity. It feels good to rejoin civilization. It was good for us to remind ourselves, although we already knew how much to appreciate those resources. We're glad to have them again.
Yeah, I mean, this is crazy that this was Texas, the energy capital of the world, as we like to say, and this is what happened to us. So for those that don't know Michael Weber, this is Thirst for Power, one of the books that I first read a few years ago as I got to know him and all the work that he did in this space. And then in addition to that, he's also got this book, Power Trip. And what I will never forget when reading Thirst for Power, Michael, is the connection you made between energy and water. And in fact, one of the things that you said that I'll never forget is if you really want to save energy, close that tap on your water, because that running water is actually proportionally more of a consumer of energy than anybody knew. Now we know. Tell us how we got to now real briefly. We've only got 30 minutes. And then I want to get into questions that come in from people that are watching on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook.
Yeah, this is great. Yeah, so the energy water nexus is that we use a lot of water for energy and a lot of energy for water. And so if you don't have enough of one, then you might not have enough of the other. So you get these codependencies that create these cascading failures. And the same is true with the gas system and the electricity system as well, where the gas system depends on electricity and electricity system depends on gas. So in this case in Texas, because it was cold, the demand was high for gas and electricity. And then we started to have frozen gas wells. We started to lose gas, which meant we lost power, which meant we lost more gas, which meant we lost even more power. And then we lost water as the water systems failed or struggled to keep things clean. So we had all sorts of cascading failures along the way.
Yeah. And so when we talk about failures across the energy sources, there was a lot of talk early on. In fact, there was even some good breakdown of the misinformation that was done on purpose. But as I understand it, all sources of energy had their troubles. Can you break that down a little bit for those that maybe didn't study as in much detail?
Sure. So I have solar panels. My solar panels were covered in snow and I wasn't isolated with a battery. So I lost power at my house from the solar. Wind turbines had ice form on the blades. There was a nuclear power plant that had a frozen pump. So we lost one of our 4 reactors in Texas. The other 2 reactors at Comanche Peak almost went down. Coal plants tripped because of equipment failures, because of the cold temperatures or frozen coal piles. Natural gas plants failed because of frozen equipment or because of the supply problems with the gas itself. They all underperformed. Gas underperformed the most, meaning they had the biggest sets of failures. However, hydroelectric overperformed. We have very little hydroelectric in Texas, but it actually did a little bit more than normal, which was good. So we had a little boost from that, not much.
And so when we're talking hydroelectric, for people that aren't experts in the field, you're talking about dams and other sources?
Falling water. Turns out gravity still works when it's cold outside, which is good news. And that stepped up. We have these old dams built 70 to 100 years ago, like on the Colorado River with the Highland Lakes, and they increased their flow of water at the depth of the crisis on February 15th, just to give us a little more boost, another tens of megawatts, which isn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it helped us stave off disaster just a little bit longer.
Yeah. And let's break down that point. You tweeted about this morning, this idea of actually being in a point of disaster, meaning that the entire power grid failed. How close did we come, and what does that mean?
Yeah, so we were within seconds to minutes of complete system-wide collapse. So just backing up a little bit, Texas is one of 3 grids in America. There's East, West, and Texas. Our isolated grid covers about 75 to 85% of the state. We have a little bit of East Texas on the eastern grid. El Paso is on the western grid. The rest of the state's basically on its own grid. And if our grid had gone down completely, it would take weeks or months to bring it back on, which is a real challenge. And we shed a lot of load, and we dropped a lot of demand by shedding load. That helped, but if not, shed the load fast enough, or if we could have brought a power plant on to help instead, we could avoid this. But we were within seconds of the whole thing going down. It was not fun to go without power for 2.5 days at my house, 5 days for some houses in Austin and elsewhere, but that's better than going weeks or months without the power.
Yeah. And something else people don't realize is how close we came for our telecommunication networks to go down completely because they are using power as well. What would that have looked like, and what would the implication have been?
Yeah, so I talked about how gas depends on electricity and electricity depends on gas and water depends on both, but there's also telecom, which depends on energy. But now our energy system is so data intensive, it depends on telecom. So the power plants don't need telecom, but a lot of our dispatching and management and the market and the bidding system requires telecom. And so it's an issue where if the power gone out and it trips off the telecom system, it makes it harder to bring everything else back on. You get people on phones trying to talk to each other to bring power plants on. If the power plants, if the whole grid had actually gone black, like if it gone completely out, not just like rolling outages or partial outages, but complete outage in Texas, that's called a black start, where you have to start from zero. One of the things that people don't realize about the power sector is power plants need the power to be on for them to work, which is sort of ironic. And there are very few power plants that can work even if the power is not on. Diesel generators do it. There are some natural gas power plants that work that way, but it's usually like hydroelectric. You use falling water to spin the turbines, and then you set up the dominoes one after another. So the grid's like a bunch of dominoes. We have hundreds or thousands of power plants. And when the dominoes fall in your pretty design, you don't set them all back up. You set them up one at a time. Yeah. That's the way it is with power plants. And the telecom system would be the same kind of thing, right? And we use a telecom to set it up, so it would be even harder.
Well, for people that don't know your work, so this is Power Trip, which is a book I highly encourage them to get. Your other book, Thirst for Power, again, talks about this nexus between energy and water. And for Texans that didn't really appreciate that combination, unfortunately, they got a lesson in the School of Hard Knocks in that. So for those of you that are watching this, this is live right now. We're on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Drop any questions or comments like Jerry did just a second ago. And by all means, if there are questions for Dr. Weber, throw those in there as well, because what we want to do is figure out how we go forward. So you're going to testify tomorrow before some organizations, committees, and caucuses at the Texas Legislature.
Just doing a briefing, a briefing for some legislators and staffers and a caucus on energy. That's right.
Yeah. And can you give us a little preview of what it is that you hope to convey to them and what the actual lawmakers that kind of set this system up indirectly, what do they need to know?
So I don't have a briefing made in terms of presentation, but there are a couple of key points I want to make. One of the key
Somehow
points
I think, Michael, you're going to be good on your feet regardless.
I'll figure it out. I've been speaking a lot on this topic, so I have a couple of things in mind. One is that there is no simple failure point and no simple solution. It wasn't like a 1-point failure and therefore a 1-point solution. We had multi-point failure. We had a lot of things go wrong, and therefore we need to make a lot of investments to prevent it from going wrong in the future. In this kind of system-wide complexity is difficult to solve, because it's technical, economic, policy, markets, sociocultural, behavioral, a lot of things we need to do. The other thing is that there are a lot of failures among the fuels and technologies. There's no one fuel and technology that's perfect. They all struggle in some ways we talked about. You see the UPS truck coming behind me, and maybe I'm about to get a book, which means my dogs will bark in just a second. They'll join the conversation.
All right, we're COVID friendly around here.
Yeah, we're live. This is what happens with live, right? So I'll talk about the complexity. The other thing is there's no quick fixes. We'll have to invest in the long haul. And I think the short story is we have underinvested in robustness for our grid. And so it's time for us to invest more in robustness. It's going to take time and money. Let's do it the right way.
Yeah. So there's a couple implications that you just brought up there. Texas not only is the energy state, but it's also home to one of the largest assemblies of military bases, installations. So for our country's national security, this is really a microcosm of our larger challenges. So what do you say to military leaders that are listening and or people that are in the military or have the opportunity to intersect in that world to think about the implications of what's going on?
The military actually thinks about resilience and robustness more than most people. So they've already done some of the exercises where they turn off the power and try to bring it back on and make sure they can work. That's the kind of exercise we haven't done statewide that maybe we should. So there are opportunities for us to do more of that, but we don't want to do it for the whole state at a time. So we have a lot to learn from the military in terms of preparedness. The other thing is the military thinks about difficult situations. They are willing to admit that sometimes things that are bad happen. That is wired into why we have a military, right? And sometimes we have an assumption that life is good and it will stay good, and we fail to anticipate that sometimes things don't go the way you want. So we need to change the way we plan. In particular, with climate science, the military for over a decade has included the risks of a changing climate into the Quadrennial Defense Review and into its planning, something we have not done yet at the state level for planning. We don't bring it in to our planning for the power sector or for the roads and highways or the water systems, that kind of thing. And so there's a national security issue that the bases are doing one base at a time at the Fort or Fort Bliss or Fort Hood or wherever it is, but we need to adopt some of that statewide. But they depend on us to do our part, to be available too. So
Yeah.
if we had a black start, we're without power for 2 months. I mean, maybe the base can come back after a day or two, but can they go a couple months without our grid supporting them? That would be pretty tricky.
And what so many people fail to understand about the robustness or the resiliency that you were referring to a second ago is that, sure, the base itself or the fort itself might be secure and can restart, but tens of thousands of the people that work on that base or support that base live off of that fort. And so it's really important. And in fact, it's a reason to give a shout out to Sharon Burke, a colleague and friend in common that we share that has been thinking about this for more than a decade.
She's ahead of the curve. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll drop a link to Sharon Burke in the text. So I see that folks are chiming in. Pete, thanks for joining us. The other thing that I'd encourage our listeners to do is explore Michael's work. This is not something new that the experts were talking about. This is not something new that those that know were suddenly surprised by. You made a comment that I found was interesting in social media, which was we were hearing from the experts during the early days of this crisis, but not our government. So what is the responsibility of government at all levels in a moment like this? Because it's going to happen again.
I mean, this is one of the things that I just did a webinar earlier, and they said, walk us through the chronology. The chronology really started around Thursday or Friday, February 11th or 12th. The weather's coming in, and people see the weather coming in. It gives you a multi-state warning. Hey, cold weather's on the way, so we can see what's happening in Colorado and other states. We know it's coming. On February 12th, I start to tell people, hey, it's going to be cold. This could break the grid. I started to tell people personally, charge up your batteries, top off your cars with gasoline, because if the power goes out, gasoline stations can't pump gasoline. Make sure you have water and food on hand. If you have propane grills, get some extra propane so you can cook and this kind of thing. So I was doing this personally with my family and my friends. And then on social media, I started to tell people, this is going to be hard. Here's what you need to do to protect your pipes from bursting, because we're going to have a freeze and what happens if the power goes out.
Yeah,
I was doing that. The governor was not doing emergency preparedness. The state wasn't doing very effective communications. This is a great role for the state to say, hey, this is going to be difficult. We can make it easier if we start to preheat our homes now, so we can set the thermostats down later and have some residual heat that lasts for a couple of days. There's a lot of things we could have done that would have reduced the amount of suffering instead of everyone going to the hardware store on the same day to buy that last tank of propane or whatever it is. So I think that's a real failing of the state of Texas, is that instead of helping us prepare for this, the people going on the news to blame renewables or whatever it was, right? I think this wasn't helpful. So that's a role for the state. Then in the depth of the crisis, there was very little communications as well, or about communications that was taking place was mostly about who to blame. In particular, Texas government's trying to blame Green New Deal or wind turbines and this kind of thing. And that wasn't helpful because people were still in a crisis mode, right? We're in the depth of the crisis and the crisis wasn't over. So there's a lot of role for government to do effective communications. And I feel like that didn't really happen. Those of us who are energy people who study this saw it coming, right? It's because it's no surprise. We've had this kind of thing before.
And for those new viewers, I will literally hold up your book that demonstrates quite literally the power trip. And then his other book, if you're wondering why I'm so fired up to have Michael with us today, The Thirst for Power, the connection between water and energy. But I diverge. Shameless plug for your efforts, because
thank you very much.
You have been talking about this. The experts knew this was a potential. And so let me just pause, because I want to take it in a slightly different direction for a second. And those of you, I've seen we have a lot of new viewers. Feel free to not only drop in questions for Michael, but it could also be comments. I'd also like to celebrate the things that did go right. Much of that was community support to each other and neighborhoods. But if you have those comments, drop them in by all means. Okay, so let's twist it and look forward.
But that's a good thing. Like, so we didn't have power. Our neighbor had power. So we would boil our water at her house. So we had another neighbor a mile away. We'd walk a mile to the neighbors to use internet and get a hot shower and that kind of thing. So there was a lot of neighborliness that was happening. A lot of people were stuck because of icy roads, because don't forget, in the middle of this, we had icy roads. So when something goes down, it's hard for crews to get there to fix it, right? So we're having problems, and you cannot get the crew of repair people to the power plant or to take the down tree off the line, that kind of thing. So there was a lot of community support, and that was really good. For us in our neighborhood, we're like, well, I guess this was a good time for us to go get our cell phone numbers of our neighbors, right? So there's always a good response when times are tough like this as well.
That was one of the greatest failings that I realized. If I need something from my neighbor Scott across the way, or Brian or Max or Trish, I literally just go and knock on their doors.
Right.
It never was ever a need to actually have their cell phones. But we are changing that now as a neighborhood, becoming more resilient. So let's look to the future, because we're literally already past the halfway mark. I knew this would go fast. So you have an opportunity to talk to the legislature. You're on NBC, you're on Bloomberg, you're all over the place right now. Let's talk about what we can do going forward. And I look at 5 areas. You pick your favorite. I think this was a combination of opportunity going forward. We can inspire a whole new generation of entrepreneurs to fix these issues. We can, at the same time, restore hope in the American dream for people with skilled labor to rebuild our infrastructure. Thirdly, we can foster innovation. There's probably got to be some better ways of doing things than we're doing right now. Fourthly, it's our infrastructure. We literally have to fix this infrastructure. And then lastly, we have to improve our broken politics because, as you said, in the middle of all this chaos, our elected leaders were going on TV, and we're talking about who to blame rather than being out there, like you say, trying to fix it. Nobody's perfect. I'm not asking you to be perfect. So in those 5 areas going forward, what are you looking at as opportunity?
I'm an engineer, so I often default to the technical solutions, but I want to just say, I know that technical solutions are one part of many, right? So we got to have all these other elements, and the politics is part of it. So there's 3 phases to a crisis like this. There's the immediate political blame game process, which lasts for days to weeks. Then there's the fact-finding forensic investigation. Let's figure out what happened. That is usually several months. And then there's phase 3, which is implement solutions based on what happened. We've been in the sort of political blame game that's kind of coming to a close. There are a lot of hearings today and tomorrow. I think that's basically going to wind down. And we're going to go into the fact-finding mission for several months to write the report, like what happened, what was the chronology, who failed first, what were the problems, and then hopefully we go to the solutions phase. Now, this is identical to what we did a decade ago, almost to the day, when we had a freeze in 2011, same kind of problem.
By the way, that was the month that I met you. You came up to D.C. with some of your students. I was supposed to participate in your energy conference, and it was canceled, if I'm not mistaken. Do I have my timeline right?
Yeah, we met you. It was at the AAAS meeting in February 2011. We met you right around. So I think the power turned off and turned back on, and then we came up and met you. So so that process in 2011 went through the blame game. Then it went through the fact finding. And then the question is, did we do step 3, implement solutions enough or not? And it looks like we didn't do enough. And there were some solutions implemented. Some power plants went to rise. There was some of it, but clearly not enough. Now we're going through this process now. It feels like the blame game is kind of winding down in a couple of days. There'll be a multi-month investigation. There has to be an investigation because there are lawsuits. There's insurance claims. They all have processes for evidence that are apolitical. They just want to know the facts. And then hopefully we arrive at a common fact base. Once we have a common fact base, the question remains, do we have the leadership and the public will and the sense of crisis enough to take action to solve it? Those solutions are things like winterizing the power plants and the natural gas supply, both of which failed us to varying degrees.
Because I heard you say that there was actually a backup to one of the thermal power stations that was run by electricity to pump the fuel.
Yeah, there are 2 things. The natural gas system froze, which tripped off 9 gigawatts of power plants. We had a lot of outages because there wasn't the gas supply. And then part of the gas supply is electrically operated. So as you have outages, it turns off electric compressors and this kind of thing, which reduces gas supply. So the gas supply was hammered in a couple of ways, but these interdependencies are something we can design for and improve. So we need to work on that, where gas failure leads to electric failure, which leads to bigger gas failure, which leads to a bigger electrical failure, leads to a crisis. So we have to work on that technical solution of winterizing the power plants, the natural gas supply, and the transmission lines. We should think about new things like macro grid, connecting to other grids, and microgrid, smaller technologies like storage and demand response. We definitely need efficiency at our homes so that we need less energy for heating our homes to a comfortable and safe level. We need to think about building more diversity in our power sector. Right now, we're pretty reliant on gas in our power sector, and that didn't work for us. So we need to think about building other power plants or other options. And so we can prioritize the gas for home heating rather than making electricity for home heating. So we have some things we can do, but we have to get through the blame phase to the investigation phase to the action phase. And the action's going to take years. It doesn't take centuries. It doesn't take days. It'll take years. We got to do it, and we have to invest for it. As you said, when you're quoting your grandma, you either pay for it now or you pay for it later. It's a lot easier to pay for it now than later, generally speaking.
Stitching time saves 9. So we literally only have 9 minutes of your time left. So I want to go fast into questions. So Mike Burke down in San Antonio says, should we continue with an independent Urcot?
This is a great question. And my engineering hunch is that we should connect to the Eastern and Western grids. But I would say it this way, we should at least do the study. Let's at least evaluate what connecting to the other grid does economically, environmentally, and for our reliability. I have a strong engineering hunch that 99.9% of the time, connecting the other grids means we can sell clean wind and solar power to other states to help them decarbonize and make
And
a
make
massive
money for
profit.
Texas.
Oh, make so much money for Texans. And then 0.1% of the time, we prop them up for reliability. They prop us up. I think it's really good for us economically and environmentally and from a reliability perspective. Let's at least do that study.
Yeah.
I think that's an option. We love to export energy. We export gas. We export oil. We export refined products. We export wood pellets. Why wouldn't we export electrons?
Yeah. Well, thank you. So we're going to go to some other. So we've got another question here. At a high level, were there other surrounding neighbor states that got hit by this storm but fared better for reasons that were fairly broad, or energy policy or structure? Like, who did this better? Oklahoma? Who did? And if you say Oklahoma, it's going to hurt my feelings a little bit, but go on.
Oklahoma and Louisiana also struggled. So they did not struggle as badly, but they had rolling outages. They had down lines. They had power plants that tripped offline because it was cold. Oklahoma prepares for the cold a little bit better because they get the cold a little more often because it's a little further north. No surprise there. And this is one of the things, if we hook up to the other grids, that doesn't guarantee the other grids have power to send us.
Right.
The other grids were struggling too. However, they can then get power from Minnesota. Like, we can start to wheel power around the nation. And so that would not have prevented outages in Texas, but it would have prevented the depth of the outage. So it would have been better, but maybe wouldn't have staved off all the problems. So I think there's some benefit there. Louisiana is interesting because we have a wholesale competitive market in Texas. They have a very regulated market. Both had failures. So it's hard to say that, oh, the problem is we have a competitive market, we should have a regulated market. The regulated market struggled as well. So I think this issue in other freezes throughout history, coal plants, other places went down. So it's not clear that more fossil fuels would have helped, frankly. And I know there's people saying that. So we need to look at winterizing our power plants the way they do in Minnesota or Iceland.
Got it. Okay. Well, I'm going to bring up, actually, I'll just try to read Peter's question because it is quite long. He's saying, as an Austin resident, or as Austin Energy failed in terms of simple power distribution line. Okay, there you go. Thank you. I don't know if you can read that, Michael. Simply put, in the distribution chain had a significant role in prevention. Austin Energy's failure was a contributing factor in the overall grid. Suggested better. So do you agree or disagree? Like, all these different independent operators, all these different independent distributors, what do you think? Who did well? Who can we hold up as examples of doing great?
Well, in the case of Austin Energy, they have a lot of trees in Austin, and the lines were built decades ago. The trees had grown up around them. So this is a constant issue. And Austin Energy has been flagging this for 15 years. Yeah. When I was on the Electric Utility Commission overseeing Austin Energy, 2008, 2013, we talked about trees a lot. And Austin Energy,
you're talking about tree trimming, not necessarily cutting them down.
Tree trimming to trim the branches away from the power line, so there's less arcing, fewer snakes, fewer squirrels, less issues with falling branches, less issue with ice. And we were dealing with it 15 years ago. And Austin Energy was always asking for more money for vegetation management. And people like me, the city council, would have to approve or not. And it was always a bone of contention because as they trim trees, people always complained, well, my tree, which was beautiful, is now ugly because you trimmed it. So Austin Energy was
like my haircut now.
Yeah, so exactly. Well, as we get older, we need different kinds of manicuring. That's true for trees and for humans. So Austin Energy, as they did the vegetation management, got criticized for it. So they were forced to reduce that. And now we have problems with ice and tree branches. Is that Austin Energy's fault, or is that the citizenry's fault for yelling at them as they trim the trees or cutting their funding? So this is part of the problem, is that the solutions we need aren't always popular because the solutions might be ugly tree trimming or expensive winterization. Yeah, this is a trade-off.
So Beverly Alcott says, how can we as the average citizen get involved so we're better prepared? I'd like you to answer that in terms of from a civic engagement, but also from your own home and what you can do.
I love this. So there are a couple of things you can do. And great question. We all have a responsibility for preparedness, but I would make sure you always have some water on site that's filtered, safe, and clean. Rain barrel water is not always clean enough, so you might need to filter it beyond that. But rain barrel water is at least good enough for flushing toilets and washing and that kind of thing, but maybe not for drinking. If you have rain barrel water, then you boil it, you can drink it. So think about rain barrels or water storage, or having just spare jugs of water. I would think about food with good shelf life. I would think about having batteries and lights and candles always available. If you have a fireplace, make sure you have dry firewood. If you have propane grills, make sure you have propane so you can cook. And make sure you keep at least one of your cars, if you have multiple cars, topped off with gasoline as much as you can. These all cost money, but there are things you can do to spare a lot of heartache when bad things happen. If you have additional resources available or programs in the city that support it, I would invest in more insulation and winterization to lower your bills at home, and possibly even solar panels and batteries to really give you off-the-grid capability. We invested in solar panels at our house, but we did not invest in the battery because it was too expensive. And when the power goes down, the solar panels go down with it. You have to have the battery to island it. So my next investment is going to be a battery. So, but that's expensive, right? So not some people can afford water, but not the battery. So, within your means and within your resources, you have different options.
Yep. Great point. Robin Rather asks a great question, which is, what is the ideal balance of energy sources inside of our power grid?
I love it. So right now we're 50% gas, 20% coal, 10% nuclear, 20% wind and solar, roughly. We have a lot of room for more wind and solar. I'd like to see that. We've got a lot of cheap, flat, windy, sunny land in Texas. We could build wind and solar here is just about as cheaply as anywhere in the world. Let's do it. We make money when we build it. We make money when we save consumers money on the cheap electricity. Landowners make money. Let's build more wind and solar. Their variability gets expensive when you get above, 70, 80% wind and solar. So you have to start thinking about other solutions like maybe big batteries or geothermal. Geothermal is a renewable, low carbon source of energy.
Shout out to Bob Medcalf and his work over at the University of Texas.
Yeah, and what I love about geothermal is it leverages the skill set of oil and gas. They're great drillers. And when you drill for oil and gas, you find oil, gas, and hot water.
Deep.
And hot water you can use. So let's use the hot water for geothermal. And so we get obsessed with wind and solar in Texas because they're cheap and easy to build. Let's do wind, solar, and geothermal. And the natural gas we use, let's think about using cleaner forms of gas, biomethane or gas for capture or gas from hydrogen, things like that. I don't think there's need for coal in Texas. It's export, it's export from Wyoming to us anyway. So maybe we don't need the coal. The nukes we have, we should probably keep as long as we can because they're low carbon forms of power. Yeah. So I think there's room for a lot more renewables in the Texas mix. I'd like to see us go that way.
Okay. So Amanda says, Texas pitches itself as the ideal place for national security missions. How would connecting to other grids change that profile? And mind you, we have to get you out of here at the top of the hour. You have 60 seconds.
It's 60 seconds. So if we connect to other grids, that could help us with reliability for the most part and lets us help other people with reliability. However, it opens the risk that a collapsing eastern or western grid will ripple through and cause our grid to go down too. So if you are connected to the other grid, you can help each other out, but it's like a wildfire. It also means it can spread from one grid to another. So it introduces some risks we need to be prepared to isolate from. It also gives us some opportunity to help each other out. So if we connect to the other grids, let's do it in a way that we can turn off if we need to protect ourselves. And this was a concern in 2003 with the big Eastern grid blackout. You don't want that grid to collapse and take ours off.
I was at West Point in the dark when that happened. As we wind down your portion, I'm going to stick around and answer some more questions from our audience. But if you have not picked up Thirst for Power by Dr. Weber, and if you have not picked up The Power Trip by Dr. Weber,
and the documentary. So that book got a documentary on PBS and Amazon Prime, and it features Joseph Kopser.
Well, you know, that's the part you can just fast forward through.
Yeah, just skip through. Exactly.
Yeah, but Dr. Weber, thanks for being here. Go on to your next interview. I'm going to stick around and answer some more questions. So thanks again.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Bye.
See you later. So again, my name is Joseph Kopser, and what we're doing today is a live interview with Dr. Michael Weber from the University of Texas at Austin, and he is a worldwide expert in the combination, the intersection between energy and water. And if you were in a state like Texas over the last 10 days, as the power grid failed, as the roads became ice, you realize that the next thing to go was our clean water. Here in Austin, it was because one of our water treatment plants not only went offline, but we also had low water pressure. And when we have low water pressure, then everything from their sprinkler systems that don't have a valve to cut it off go backwards into the clean water. And if dirt mixes with those water sprinkler systems, it's a hot mess. So I'm going to stick around for a few minutes. I've got some more questions that we haven't answered. Some I can answer, others I can't. For the ones that I can't answer, I'm going to definitely make sure that you check out anyone from Michael Weber, who we just talked about, Sharon Burke. So Nora, if you would bring up Daryl's, I think it was Daryl. Yeah, Daryl's question. He says, the technical solutions are well known and easy to implement, albeit at some cost. Yes. Some of the building resilience and the fuel supply, generation equipment, and T&D, maybe R&D, but T&D. The tough part is filling the non-technical gaps, commercial, legislative, political, communication, all the way down to neighborhoods. And that, of course, there's cost. So here's the biggest thing I say, and I don't know how you feel about this, Daryl, but the biggest cost is to not do anything. Numbers are starting to roll in right now. It looks like this episode in the Texas energy economy perhaps might be a greater economic disaster than even Hurricane Harvey. Just try to imagine that. And one of the reasons why it's hard for people to imagine is because they think, well, your power went out. But for a lot of families, the power's out for so long, all the food in their fridge was wasted. So even if the only thing that happened to them was their power went out, that was $150, $200 worth of food. And you multiply that times millions of Texas families. Think about the lost economic opportunity. So you're right, Daryl. The hardest part is all of the non-technical. But I'll tell you, Amy and I are going to be looking into water storage. We're also going to be looking into accelerating our decision for solar on the roof as well as a battery power on the wall. So Mike asked a question. Oh, Beverly asked another question. Would burying power lines help the issue of trees and power lines? Is that feasible? It is not only feasible, Beverly, but there are a lot of new developments being done that on purpose bury it, whether it's by regulation or by aesthetic. If you've ever been in a neighborhood that has all of its lines buried, it's a very different feel from a neighborhood where the lines are still above ground. I happen to live in Circle C in South Austin. All of our lines are buried. But one thing I need to caution everyone, especially if you're building a new home or moving into a new home, if we don't bury the water pipes deep enough and it's still up high enough that it can actually freeze when the ground freezes, even if your home is winterized, if your pipes are not buried deep enough, that could happen to you again. So we want to make sure that happens. So Mike asked a question, who is benefiting from the current energy management systems that we have? Mike, it's not an easy answer, but we all are, but the benefits are not evenly distributed. So here's what I mean. So the easiest target for people to like to pick on are the energy producers. The energy producers have an agreement with the state and the state distributors, that's part of Urcot, and they can at any given time have moments where energy is in demand and they may make a lot of money. But generally speaking, throughout the normal course of the year, when it's not extremely cold or extremely hot in the state of Texas, they don't make a whole lot of money on the margin because we have a competitive marketplace, meaning that prices are low. Now, we deregulated as a state, Texas did, with Democrats and Republicans voting to deregulate it in the 1990s under the leadership of then President George Bush. What we didn't count on or didn't plan well enough, as Dr. Weber laid out so nicely, is in 2011, when we saw the susceptibility or the fragility of our grid when it got too cold, we didn't make the necessary changes. And it would have cost money. And as I said in a recent LinkedIn post, that money is always paid forward, and it always paid forward to the customer, the taxpayer, the individual. So even if a company has to pay it, they're going to pass those costs along in higher prices, and it's always going to get back to you. Just like my grandmother said, a stitch in time will save 9, or as I say, and from a business standpoint, you're always going to get what you pay for. So let's see if we have anything else left before we tune out. I think we've got everything. Nor, if you see anything else, throw it up. I've got private chat. Let's see. Okay. Yeah. Oh, let's plug one more time. Thanks, Nora, for that reminder. Michael Weber's documentary. It's a 6-part series on Amazon and PBS, and he breaks down energy and water and how power is involved with all 6 elements, from cities to transportation, water itself, the history of electricity, even how we use energy in war. It's a fabulous documentary. I absolutely recommend it to everybody. So having done these live events quite a bit, I know there's about a 30-second delay between what I'm seeing and reading and what I'm seeing and getting back from you all. So I'm going to stick around for a second, see if there's any last comments. Otherwise, I'm going to sign off. I want to remind everybody, while I do this little wind down, to stay connected through either USTomorrow.us, where our mission is basically to do everything we can to take the noise and the drama out of our political system, because I'm convinced that in the end, we have far more in common than that what separates us. And if we can just get all the serious people to the table, we're going to figure out ways to solve even our toughest problems. So that's the first place you can stay connected. Second place is right here on social media, either through LinkedIn, Facebook, or YouTube. For those of you that know me, I'm quite often on a lot of these platforms, probably too much, especially would I'd say Amy and the kids would say that, but I'm having too much fun as we're figuring out new ways to connect during the era of COVID to stay off. So it looks like it's all the comments for today. I'm Joseph Kopser with a special edition of Catalyst Talks in partnership with USTomorrow. We interviewed Dr. Michael Weber on the breakdown of the Texas power and water ecosystems. We want to rebuild our infrastructure. We want to foster innovation. We want to reconnect people to the American dream. We want to mentor that next generation of problem solvers to fix all this. And then lastly, we want to try to improve and fix our politics. I'm Joseph Kopser. Thanks for tuning in. Take care.